Hello, my name is Chris Jewett and we are here to do the build video for the Extreme Flight 64-inch MXS. In this build video, we're going to kind of focus on what's different between the 60-inch airplanes and the 48-inch planes, and what's different between the MXS and the other Extreme Flight planes. Let's get started. In general, when I'm unboxing an airplane, first thing I want to do is check for fit and finish, make sure everything looks nice. Things like anti-rotation pins, mounting tabs, and servo bays are built correctly and are glued. You want to make sure the hinges line up properly and are centered. Generally, this is the time when you want to find out if there's something wrong with an airplane right after you've unboxed it and not after you've started to build it. When you're taking things out of the box, you want to cut the tape off where it's mounted down. Prying the tape off or prying the piece away from the tape could actually damage the piece you're working on. Again, as you take it out of the package, this is when you want to check to make sure the hinges are centered, the fit and finish is good, there's no warps. One thing to point out on the elevator is that the control arm holes have not been pre-cut, so you can actually decide which side the servos go on for the elevator. This will come into play later. As with the elevator, the control horn slots have not been pre-cut in the rudder, so we can decide later which side the servo will go on. The cowlings are pretty durable, but if you bend them in the wrong way, they can be fragile and the paint can chip. So the best thing to do is to cut this piece of cardboard out and then remove it from the bag, instead of pulling on the cardboard and trying to rip it away from the bag. And with fiberglass pieces, I just like to check around the edges to make sure there's no chipped paint or any cracks already present in the fiberglass. Generally not a problem with Extreme Flight planes, but it's a good thing to check anyway because now's the time to find it. One thing that's a little different with this plane is the wingtips are made from wood. It's unbelievable how well they're made and that they're covered. They almost look like they're painted from the outside. Even better than the plastic wings. The wheel pants are also made a little bit differently on this plane. They've got a more sturdy mounting block and they're made from a different type of material. Now I'm lining up everything out of the hardware package and getting it ready to use. I like to organize everything on the bench in the order that I'm going to use it and get it ready so when I start building the plane I don't have to hunt around and find parts or tools. Once I've got the fuselage out of the bag, I like to inspect the hatch, make sure it's in good shape, that it's glued all the way around the wooden frame, that the corners aren't broken. We've actually got supports in the corners now so that they don't break that easily. And then once you've inspected it and you're happy with it, set it aside and get it off the bench, because this is the one thing that's easy to damage when you're working on something if you drop it. The next thing I'm going to do is get out my iron and go over all the seams of the ultra coat on the airplane. This thing's been in a box on a ship around the world. A little bit of humidity change, a little bit of temperature change. And not only that, but tightening down the seams now, especially on the trim pieces and the areas where the covering comes together, will really save you a lot of hassle down the road and give you a nice quality airplane with a durable finish. This is one of the steps I think people skimp on. It's worth it to take the time to do this right now. After you've got the covering cleaned up, we're going to go over every single wooden part of the airplane that we can reach with some thin CA on every single joint that we can get to. Get yourself a good glue tip like the one I've got here that'll allow you to reach into small spaces and put a little tiny bit of glue. Without the glue tip, you can create a lot of mess with this thin CA. There are 4 control horns in the kit. One of them is different. It's a little bit shorter on the tab. The one that's short goes in the elevator. So the first step of gluing the control horn in is to cut the slot open, push the control horn into place, and then we're going to grab a pen and trace around it. After we've traced around it, we're going to use a very sharp number 11 blade, and we're going to cut up the covering. It's important to make sure that you don't push too hard when you're cutting, because you just want to go through the first layer of covering so that we can lift it up and not cut into the balsa. Next, we're going to get the control arms ready to install. We're going to scuff up the bottom side of this piece of the control arm and then the tab of the control arm itself, and then glue it in place with epoxy. I'm using a simple sanding block here to scuff up the pieces. It's very important anytime you're gluing something to or in the airplane that you clean it with alcohol before you put it in. This will clean off all the oils from your hands or the waxes that you might have been using, and make sure you get a good glue joint. It will also take the ink off of the covering that we used to trace around the control horn on the aileron. I'm using 15-minute epoxy here. You could probably use 5-minute and use one batch on each side, or 30 minutes and do the whole thing in one batch. The idea here is you want to use a thin stick or some other device to get glue down into the slot and fill up the slot completely. Then you're going to want to soak out the bare wood that we opened up. Then also put glue on the control horn side and push it into place before we clean it up. After we've got the control horn in, we're going to clean up the excess glue with a dry paper towel and then come back with alcohol to remove the excess epoxy on the wing. We're going to do the hinges now, and this is a great example of why you never want to just glue the hinges in and fly the airplane. These hinges came from the factory most of the way into the aileron. These things would have failed within several flights. So I definitely recommend you pull the aileron off, pull out the hinges, clean up the covering, clean up the hinge slots, put the hinges in yourself, and make sure that they're centered before you glue them. And by centered, I mean 50% of the hinge in the wing and 50% of the hinge in the aileron. The real trick to getting the hinges in is you want to put the hinges into one control surface, either into the wing or the aileron, and then you want to use your fingers from bottom and top of the wing to squeeze that surface together to hold the hinge in place. So here I'm squeezing from the top of the wing and the bottom of the wing to hold the hinge in place so I can slide the aileron onto it. By pinching the trailing edge of the wing together, it's gripping the hinge and not allowing the hinge to move as I'm sliding the aileron onto the hinge. Before you start gluing, you want to check the gap at the root and the tip to make sure that nothing is binding on the side force generator or the root. To set the hinge gap properly, you want to have it at the maximum deflection before it starts to pull apart the hinge gap. Right here is the maximum mechanical deflection of this aileron on this hinge. After I glue in this hinge and let it dry for a second, I'm going to go to the next hinge and do the same thing. If you do this properly, you'll have an even hinge gap that goes the whole length of the wing, and you'll be able to get maximum throw out of your ailerons in both directions. After you've hit the first side, you're going to flip it over, clean up the excess CA, and glue it from the top side. Once you've done that once, you're going to flip it over and do it again. So each hinge is going to get 2 hits of glue from each side, so 4 per hinge. This procedure will give you a nice, even, very strong hinge gap and allow you to get maximum deflection from your ailerons. I'm using 7245 high voltage, high-tech servos on this application. What we're going to do is make sure the output gear is going forward. We're going to use our automotive parts grabber here to grab the servo extension and pull it through the wing. And as always, you'll want to pre-drill your servo holes, hit them with some thin CA before you put the servos in to set the threads. In the Dubro heavy-duty servo arm pack, there are 2 arms that we're going to use. There are the long ones, which we'll use for the rudder and elevator in my right hand, and those 2 are the medium ones, which we'll use on the ailerons. When setting up your aileron geometry, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your aileron is centered, and then you want to make sure that your servo arm is 90 degrees to the push rod where it connects to the control horn. And make sure to use blue Loctite on any metal-to-metal connection. With the servos I'm using, the servo arms sit too high off of the wing, and with the ball link on top of the arm, it actually binds on the servo arm and twists the servo arm at maximum deflection. Easy fix, you just take the ball link and move it underneath the servo arm. You should check this on your servos because each servo will be different. So when I'm building the landing gear axles, I like to put the wheels on and then put the wheel collar on and then tighten down the set screw so it'll put a mark in the metal. Once I figure out where that mark is, I can use my grinding tool to put a little flat spot on there, then reinstall the wheel, then the lock nut with some blue Loctite. After you get your axle and wheel assembly built, go ahead and install them in the landing gear loosely. Just hand tighten this nut for now. We'll come back later and tighten it with the wheel pans. The landing gear are directional, so you need to know which side goes forward. The flat edge goes forward. This allows us to figure out which way to put the wheel pants on. Because the axles are loose, you can slip the wheel pants up over the axle and onto the axle. You're going to need to use a tool. I use forceps to reach in and grab the wheel collar. That will allow you to tighten the nut on the back. And because we flat spotted the wheel collar, it won't twist and will allow us to do this. We do not want to tighten the wheel pants completely. We want them to still be loose and adjustable so we can actually set the stance of the airplane after we get the tail wheel on. Use 4 3mm bolts and washers from the hardware kit and blue Loctite and install the landing gear. One of the main things that separates the MXS from the other planes in terms of building is this piece right here. On the other planes you would cut that piece out. On the MXS you do not cut that piece out. First thing you do is you put in the elevator, flip it over, and then slide in the stab. This is the only thing that's different from the MXS to the Extra or the Edge in terms of building. Now before you actually glue the stab into place, you're going to want to put the hinges into the stab, just like we did with the ailerons, and glue the hinges in first. Then we'll go back and glue the stab into the airplane. Here I'm just using the back of the knife to kind of slide the hinge into place so it lines up with the hinge gap in the stab. Using the exact same technique we used in the ailerons to set the hinge gap, go ahead and set the hinge gap for the elevator. A little bit different though, the elevator is hinged with a much sharper bevel, so you can actually get like 90 degrees out of this thing before it binds. So get your hinge gap as tight as you can, up to about 90 degrees, because you're never going to be able to get more than that from the servo. Use a little piece of tape on the counterbalance here to straighten out the elevator to the stab. This will allow us to use the stab as a reference to the wing tube to make sure that it's in the airplane straight. There are several points of reference you can use to make sure that the stab is in the airplane straight. The first one is the wing tube. You want to also look at the gap between the elevator halves, the gap between the two holes that are laser cut into the stab. Then also from the inside of the airplane, from the back and from the front, you can actually see the center marks on the stab from the inside. Can't really see it from the camera, but if you could look past the elevator joiner, you could see the center of the stab there. So look over the back, make sure it's even with the stab tube. Most of the times they are. I've very rarely seen one that isn't. Then step back from the airplane and make sure that it visually looks straight. And then again, this is a picture from the inside all the way back to the stab. You can kind of see where the stab is centered. You can mark it with a marker to make it easier to see. Once you're happy with the way everything is lined up, go ahead and start hitting it with some thin or medium CA. Start with one side, get it wet, check your incidences and angles and make sure everything is good again, and then do the other, and then the other, and then the other until you've gotten all four sides glued. Make sure you've got some paper towel handy to wipe up any glue. The thin CA tends to run out of the front of the stab hole, which is easy to take off with debonder, but if you're ready with the paper towel, you can go ahead and get it. While the stab dries, we're going to build the tail wheel. Very similar to the way we did the axles, we use the set screws to mark the spots on the tail wheel where we need to make flat spots. Use the Dremel cutoff tool to flat spot it, put everything back together with blue Loctite, and then we'll install it on the plane. Before we can install the tail, we need to go ahead and install the rudder just like we did with the elevator and the ailerons. Sure to set the gap between the counterbalance to where there's no rubbing, and also to where the bottom of the rudder lines up with the bottom of the fuselage. When mounting the tail wheel, you want to make sure the part that turns lines up perfectly with the rudder hinge line. We're going to drill ourselves a pilot hole and use one of the wood screws with some thin CA to get the tail wheel in place before we drill the second hole. The tiller arm screw is the one screw in the hardware package that's different from all the others. It's the only one that doesn't have a washer attached to the head. In the center of the tiller arm, we're going to drill a hole in the rudder in the center. Then we're going to come back and fill up the hole that we just drilled with CA and bend the tail wheel out of the way while we put the tiller arm screw in place. Now that we have the tail wheel in place, we can set the stance of the airplane. I like to set the wheel pants about 1 finger off the ground so the tails aren't dragging, and where the nose is high enough up to where when it's sitting on the spinner that they're also not dragging. Once you've got them cosmetically straight, go ahead and tighten up the axle nut to make sure that they're tight. You've also got the option on this plane to put a screw into the landing gear to hold the wheel pants in place. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. I kind of feel like if you don't put that screw in, the wheel pan will have room to move, and if you hit it on something, you won't break it. Please proceed to build video 2.